right. It's so cool to do this in this beautiful place with all these beautiful people. Can everyone hear me okay? It's good. All right. So by way of introduction, so I'm Dave Rosenfeld. I wear two hats. My primary hat is I'm the director of a nonprofit group called the Solar Rights Alliance, which is the nonprofit association of California solar users. We believe that everyone has the right to make energy from the sun without unreasonable interference from the utility. We keep track of what the politicians and the regulators and the utilities are up to, and then we alert the public when there is a threat to rooftop solar or an opportunity to make it more available to more people. We have a network of about 150,000 supporters around the state who have rooftop solar. It's very, very diverse, as we're going to get into, which is like the best job I've ever had. So that's one hat, and that's primarily my home team. The other thing I do is I loosely coordinate a network of other NGOs. We call it the Save California Solar Coalition. And I say loosely because it's not anything other than just kind of a coalition of the willing of NGOs and super activists that care about expanding rooftop solar and making it more available and defending people's ability to do that. And unlike us, where like this is like really the one reason why we exist, lots of other NGOs might work on a wide variety of things. This may not be their top thing, but it's something they care about. So I work to try to kind of keep us aligned and working together to fight. So that's kind of like the two hats. Let's go to the next slide. And we're going to talk about the situation in California. I know there's a lot of Californians here. There's a lot of people who are not from California. And I assume kind of like one premise we can agree on is that, you know, for better or for worse, so goes California. You know, California just tends to lead the way on a lot of this stuff. And so I'm going to kind of prevail on everyone to kind of just work with that premise on just why this is so important, what happens here. And the situation with rooftop solar is, and when I say rooftop solar, I'm also talking about ground mount systems. I'm also talking about community solar. I'm talking about behind the meter solar, basically, you know, owned by, you know, whoever's behind the meter, whether you're a homeowner or a renter or a farmer or a business or a, you know, whatever, a consumer. That's what I'm talking about. You know, solar that is not owned by the utility, and I am also talking about batteries. So I'm just going to say rooftop solar, but I mean all of those things when I'm saying it. All right. So just a quick little bit of a history and then kind of how we got to here and what's going on. So in California, it all started with the Million Solar Roofs Initiative back in 2005. You know, coming out of a big scandal with Enron, you know, there was a political moment where Governor Schwarzenegger and the legislature worked to basically jumpstart. They had a new vision for let's actually jumpstart a clean energy industry in California that's based on delivering you know, new choices to consumers, that's going to help accelerate our transition off of fossil fuels, that's going to create jobs, good working class jobs that get people into the middle class. And so that's what happened. Next slide. And under the Million Solar Roofs Initiative starting in 2005, solar became mainstream. I mean, there was not very much solar in California at that time. There was about 20,000 systems. If you wanted solar at that point, you had to be either very technical or wealthy. And if you fast forward just about a decade and a half later, you didn't have to be either in order to be able to get it. Under the Million Solar Roofs, solar became mainstream. This is one of my favorite things, is that there's 6 times more solar in Kern County than there is in the city of San Francisco, even though they have the same population. Kern County is a rural Central Valley, you know, area, right? So like, this is, you know, you've cracked the code when people are getting solar, not because they want to protect the environment, but for some other reason. And that's what happened. Next slide. 60% of all rooftop solar users in California are middle and working class households. Half are people of color. And next slide. And it's just been really good for California. It lowers, the key thing with rooftop solar is it's good for the individual household that has it, but it's also good for all ratepayers because the more that people make their own energy, it's the same thing as energy efficiency or conservation. The more that people don't buy electricity from the grid, then it reduces the need for the utility to have to spend money on poles and wires and other infrastructure that just costs a lot of money. And that reduces the cost of the grid for all ratepayers over time. But that only works if then the utility and state energy planners actually take what's happening seriously. And so this is where we get into what's been going on in California. Next slide. So in 2019, about a decade and a half after the Million Solar Roofs Initiative was launched, California hit its millionth solar roof, and there was a big celebration that we held at a high school that had been solarized in Clovis in the Central Valley, a pretty low-income community that in a conservative part of the state. Just a shining example of just how this thing had been really, really successful. We had Governor Schwarzenegger was there, Governor Brown was there. I'm kind of like hanging out in the back over there. Notably, Governor Newsom, who had been invited, did not come and didn't even issue a statement kind of celebrating that milestone. And it was a big day. It was really, really cool, but there was a little bit of foreboding about like, why didn't he, what's going on here? So next slide. And as it turned out, between 2022 and 2024, the Newsom administration basically gutted the state's rooftop solar policies. And I'll breeze through these, and this is kind of side more, we can get into details. We'll release these slides for people. In 2022, there was a bill. This was kind of the first shot across the bow that basically made it impossible to do kind of small commercial projects like, like on a church or a food bank. Basically classified those as public works projects, which is total BS, which means they would have to run through the same hoops as if you were building like a bridge or a highway or that kind of thing. No church or food bank is going to be able to do that. Then really the bad stuff started happening. So in December of 2022, the Public Utilities Commission basically eviscerated the net metering program, slashing the value of the energy that you send back to the grid by about 80%. Just basically destroying the value proposition for your average solar user. Then a year later, this is now going back last year, the CPUC did a round two, this time going after properties that have more than one meter. So now you're talking about schools, farms, multifamily homes, all these kinds of situations where you have more than one meter, and they gutted that program. Here we call it virtual net metering or net metering aggregation. And they went even a step further. It was a worse decision than the one that they did for homeowners, because at least for homeowners, they didn't go after your ability to use the electricity that you generate behind the meter to offset your utility load. There, they basically prohibited any multi-meter property from being able to self-consume. In other words, they said all of the electricity that you produce, if it's on a multifamily home or in a farm or that kind of context, is the property of the utility. And if you want it, you got to buy it back from them. So that's what they did there, is they destroyed self-consumption for that class of customers. And then last year, they went a step further, and the state licensing board basically stripped solar installers of the ability to be able to install and maintain batteries, even batteries that they themselves had installed to begin with. And then finally, in May, we had two excellent decisions by the Utilities Commission. I'm being sarcastic. One imposed one of the highest, what we call a utility tax in the country, basically a fixed charge on all ratepayers. It's going to start at $24 a month, which is already twice as high, twice the national average. It's uncapped, and the utilities have already said they want that to be $70 a month just for the pleasure of being hooked up to the utility, which, by the way, will increase bills on millions of ratepayers, not just solar users, but has the special effect of basically clawing back all of the savings that a solar user would have, even if they have a battery, which is the intent of the whole thing. And then shortly after, the CPUC also just voted to make community solar completely impossible to do in California. So behold, that is the Newsom administration's, what they've done to date. Next slide. And so in 2023, California celebrated its 2 millionth solar rooftop. This is amazing, right? In 2019, it took a decade and a half to get to the first million. And then it took just 4 years to get to the 2nd million. But there was no celebration because this was last year, and California's rooftop solar industry was melting down. It took 20 years to build this amazing thing, and it took just a few years for it to completely melt down. And so there have been bankruptcies. Let's go to the next slide. But the first thing, I guess, what happened is when you do all of these things, rooftop solar adoptions just plummeted. So this is right before the main decisions went into effect. And then this is solar adoptions, excuse me. And you can see there was a peak right before it was going to go into effect because there was a rush for the gates, and then it cratered. And this is adoptions by income. And so what you can see that is most of the adoptions that have been happening and that have been most ascendant is that income band between $50,000 and $100,000 a year. In California, that is solidly middle class, by the way, just because the cost of living is so high. And you can see that's been the biggest band of adopters, and it's been growing. And then, of course, they really took advantage of it. But now you can see it's gone down. We're going to show you a couple of slides just so you can really see how far back that we've been set. But this has been a big setback for working and middle class people being able to get that rooftop solar. Next slide. So here's another way of looking at just what the setback has been. This is adoptions from January to April of each year. So it's not a full year of adoptions, but it's just a half year because we wanted to, we did this kind of halfway through the year, so we wanted to make sure that we were being fair. So you can see in 2024, adoptions at that point of the year was as low as it was back in 2014. So there's been an argument by the Newsom administration that don't worry, this isn't a big deal. There was just a big rush to the gates when the change is made, and then everything is going to rebound. And what we've been saying is, no, this is a permanent structural change that is causing adoptions to plummet, and this is one way to look at it. Next slide. The other side of this story is that because consumers are not getting solar as much because it's harder to afford, is that solar companies are now starting to have to lay off their employees. And in California, you have your Sunruns and you have your Teslas and you have your like big Wall Street companies, but most of the solar market in California, about 70% of it, is small and medium-sized businesses all over the state. It's really an incredible industry, and so it employs, at the peak, it employed about 65,000 workers, really good jobs. You don't need a college education. You can, make about like $70,000 a year is like the average. They come with benefits. We've lost about 17,000 jobs. We've lost today, so about a third of the rooftop solar workforce has been laid off, in the process. Next slide. Battery installations are down. For those of you who have been following the story, one of the claims of the Newsom administration was like, we're doing this to actually increase battery attachment rates because it's great, we have all this solar, but we have a duck curve, so we need people to have batteries for this to work, and so we're changing the incentives so that people will get batteries. And one thing that we had warned was that, well, you can't have a battery unless it's being charged by solar, and if people aren't going to get solar, then you're not going to get the battery. And they were like, no, sleight of hand, blah, 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 blah. P.S., as we predicted, battery adoptions are down. Now, it is true, the percentage of installations that is happening that is attached to a battery is up, and so the Newsom administration, the way they're trying to spin this is being like, look, battery attachment rates are up. And we're like, yeah, no duh, but overall battery installations are down and you wanted more battery. So that's what's going on with batteries. Next slide. And then the utility tax, which I referenced earlier, is just going to make this whole thing worse. That has not gone into effect yet. That's going to start next year in 2026. It's going to start at $24 a month for most ratepayers, and then the CPUC is already going to, talking about raising that to $50, $70, $100 a month. Already with $24 a month, I believe, you're the expert who actually calculated this stuff we have in the room, but about 4 million households are going to see their bills go up as a result because, as it turns out, a high fixed charge tends to penalize those who don't use a lot of electricity. Well, who doesn't use a lot of electricity? Renters, people who live in small homes, lower income households, and people who have rooftop solar. Basically what went on here, I don't have any evidence of this, is that the utilities wanted to go after rooftop solar so bad that they were willing to use low-income people and renters basically as collateral in order to be able to get at that. So that's going into effect. We haven't even seen what the impacts of that's going to be. Next slide. And so then you just go, all right, so like what, surely somebody's going to step in and do something about it. And by the way, I'm giving you all the bad news first. We're going to turn this ship around. But we really do want to hit people over the head with how bad things are because there's just too much out there that's telling a muddy story, and I'm not in the business of telling muddy stories. Like, I don't think this is a muddy story, so where there's bad news that needs to be delivered, it ought to get delivered, so that's what I'm doing today. And so this is a cartoon, I think it speaks for itself. Good news is there's a couple of legislators who really got the memo, and this year made a hard push to try to reverse this damage. But the powers that be in the legislature, this would be Governor Newsom and the leadership, basically squashed, killed, or just gutted beyond recognition all of that legislation. There is one that is still alive, and I'll mention it later. But for the most part, the effort this year to try to turn things around has pretty much failed. And so that's where that stands. Next slide. And so we'll move on then to a little bit of the utilities arguments. But this is bad for everyday people, but I think for those of us climate activists, this also just turns the state's clean energy goals into a joke. And so next slide. So let's just remember one thing. In California, despite all the headlines, natural gas is still the largest source of electricity in California, and it's been stuck at about 40% for a couple of years. That's despite growth in renewable energy. And so, this is rooftop solar, this is utility scale solar, and this is wind. And so we are getting an increasing amount of our electricity from those sources, but we're still getting a heck of a lot of our electricity from fossil fuels, and we're kind of stuck there. Notice how we're getting about half of our solar from rooftop and half of our solar from solar farms. It's about half and half. So that's where we stand. So just one kind of sidebar is, for those of you that have seen headlines like California has too much solar, we're making too much solar, and they're actually giving it off to Arizona. Has anyone seen those headlines? Yeah. So no, we don't have too much solar. We have too much natural gas. That's what we have. You might have seen the headline, on the coolest but sunniest day in April or May, California got 100% of its electricity from renewables. And people go, yes, California has reached it. Yes, that was a cool day when nobody was running any appliance, and it was really, really sunny for most of the day. That's really easy to do, but nobody ever does the headline of what do you do on the hottest day in August or September. I can assure you that's when we're firing up natural gas plants that are polluting the lungs of children in our cities all around the state. So that's where we stand, and that's a real reality check on California. Next slide. And so then we're just now completely off track. And so just to talk about rooftop solar for a second, the Energy Commission sets goals for where we need to be for all of the different kinds of energy classes: rooftop solar, solar farms, wind farms, geothermal, blah, 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 blah. And they have a goal for rooftop solar, which is that we roughly need to add about 20 gigawatts of rooftop solar by 2030 to stay on track. And we were on track before the CPUC made these changes. This is the line of where we would have been over the next bunch of years. We were doing good. Forget these other lines, but this dark orange line is now the trajectory that we're on for meeting the rooftop solar goals that were set. So we're not going to get to 20 gigs by 2030. Okay, next slide. And then to kind of zoom out, now let's just talk about all solar. Let's talk about solar farms and wind farms. All solar, we need to get about 6 gigs a year over the next bunch of years to get off fossil fuels, essentially. And you can see in the last couple of years, we've never gotten to 6 gigs. We've gotten close, but not quite there. And you can see, as shown in the other slide, about half of it comes from distributed, and then half of it, thank you, comes from solar farms. Well, now this is what we're projecting you're going to get from distributed, from rooftop solar. So the rest of it has to be made up with solar farms. You're not going to be able to do that. I mean, yes, we can speed up probably the building of solar farms, but there's still just enough permitting, land space issues, all those kinds of things that they're not going to be able to build enough solar farms to make up the difference. So now the state is even more behind than it was before. Next slide. So how do they justify doing this? If people have heard of the term cost shift, then you're familiar, but effectively it goes like this. People who have rooftop solar don't pay their fair share of the grid. They've taken their ball and gone home, but we still have costs. And all of those costs now are shifted onto the people that don't have solar. And that's the reason why electricity prices are so high in California. In other words, you rooftop solar users are the reason why other Californians are paying out of the nose for electricity. That's called the cost shift argument. And they have sold that argument very, very well to the decision makers in California and to some extent members of the media. Next slide. It's utility PR. It is not based in reality. And the real cause of high electricity prices is out of control utility spending. I want to show you a couple of slides from an energy economist, Richard McCann. He's the source of these. So next slide. So the reason why electricity prices are through the roof is because of utility spending on poles and wires, also called transmission and distribution. This is what utility spending on poles and wires would have been over the last 20 years if it had simply risen at the rate of inflation. This is what it actually has been. So then you might ask, well, gosh, they must have been doing that spending because electricity demand has been going up. But that's not the case. This purple line is what peak demand has actually been over the last bunch of years. It's been flat. I mean, there's been a little bit of this, a little bit of that, but it's basically been flat. So they've been spending like drunken sailors on poles and wires, way above the rate of inflation, to meet a demand that hasn't actually been growing. It's been staying the same. So next slide. Why has electricity demand been flat? One big reason why is the growth of rooftop solar. The more that people were making their own electricity, they were not using the grid as much. So even though the population was increasing, the economy was growing, we were beginning to do electrification. And state energy planners and utilities knew this. And year after year, they continued to forecast more energy demand than the facts on the ground were demonstrating, which gave utilities the permission structure to then go to the regulators and get approval for more and more spending on poles and wires. Next slide. So anyway, if you then take a look, rates track the rate hikes that we have seen over the last bunch of years track almost one-to-one with utility spending increases. For PG&E, next slide. For Edison, next slide. For San Diego Gas and Electric, next slide. And so almost all the rate increases are due to utility overspending. About 92% can be attributed to utility overspending on poles and wires. Not rooftop solar, next slide. Not wildfire mitigation, which is the other big excuse that you hear. Wildfire mitigation is a thing, but it's about like 11 to 12% of all utility spending in the last 2 years. Most of this is poles and wires. Next slide. And so as a result, utility profits are soaring. Why? Because that's how they make their money. Utilities make their money. Every dollar they spend building poles and wires, they get to tack an 8 to 10% profit on it. And so you built in, that's their incentive structure. It's literally a blank check. The more they spend, the more they profit. So of course they want to spend more on poles and wires. And so then they spend literally tens of millions of dollars on the political process in order to be able to get regulators in that do what they want. And so that's essentially the connection. Next slide. The cost shift is literally invented by the utility industry. We have the leaked memo that, where they from 2012, where they outline all this stuff. Next slide. And all the math that the government in California relies on was done by a utility consulting firm called E3. If you look at their clients, it is all of the North American private utilities. It's a total conflict of interest, and they're the ones that are doing the actual math that the regulators then trumpet as going, this is the math. Next slide. Let's skip this one because we're running out of time. Let's skip this one because I've already made that point. Rooftop solar and batteries, I assume it's very, very clear to this group that it benefits everyone. This is good for consumers. Working people can control their energy bills and protect themselves and keep their power on. California can meet their clean energy goals on schedule. Open space is protected. The grid gets cheaper as we've gone through, and it becomes more reliable and less prone to power outages. Next slide. We need real clean energy leadership in California. I think the program is pretty simple. If the state really wants to turn things around, we have to guarantee the right to self-generate. That's just got to be a basic thing, number one. Number two, we need a new goal. We should be pushing for 6 million solar rooftops and 1 million solar-powered batteries. That's the kind of like bold new goal that the state needs. And then the third is we got to stop scapegoating consumers who are part of the solution and actually hold them up as heroes, the people that are actually doing the right stuff. Next slide. One bright spot is there is a bill currently now headed, it's passed the Senate, it's headed to the Assembly. It's a little bit of a miracle that it's still alive, which would partially restore the right of multi-metered properties to self-generate. The bill has been grossly weakened, but it still would protect most multifamily homes and schools and allow them to be able to go back and at least be able to own the electricity that they generate. Farmers and shopping centers and other multi-meter properties were thrown under the bus. We'll have to deal with that another time. So that's going to be coming up in the Assembly, and if it passes, then we'll push to get the governor to sign it. And final slide is then just where do we go from here? We are so far behind in the legislature. Anyone that's on the ground in the legislature kind of knows like the utility misinformation has really sunk in. So the project that we think we want to keep trying to push legislation to turn things around because we don't think that's going to come from the regulators or Governor Newsom. But we think there's a first order issue that needs to happen here, which is we need to just actually, and we're going to do this with like brute force really, is just ground truth to discussion. First is that the utilities are lying about rooftop solar, and that the real reason why electricity rates are going up is they're out of control spending on poles and wires, not rooftop solar. That rooftop solar and batteries has been sent off a cliff. The Newsom administration, when reporters call, like just literally denies that these numbers have any reality. So we actually have to convince reporters in the legislature there is a crisis. This industry that you built that employs tens of thousands of people is on fire. That California is actually behind on its clean energy goals. Again, spin from the government is that we're doing just fine. We want to ground truth and go, no, you're not fine. And if you care about these clean energy goals and getting off fossil fuels, then you need to have a reality check. And then finally is that rooftop solar and batteries is one of your solutions. It's a cornerstone solution not just for clean energy goals, but it's a tool that you can use to lower the cost of the grid and over the longer term, give ratepayers the kind of relief that they need so California just isn't so crazy expensive with respect to electricity. So that's the primary project that we want to try to encourage people to participate in addition to kind of like bills and all the kind of day in and day out kind of stuff, is changing the story. And that's what I got. I'm done. I don't know if we're out of time. Yeah.
I'm just curious if you have any information on breakdown of poles and wires, how much of that is necessary, how much of it is stuff that was deferred, how much of it is planning for future load growth. Like, do we have any more resolution to kind of combat the argument that this is just like necessary, work this weekend?
Yeah, it gets devilishly tricky really, really fast. And I don't want you to kind of get the impression that what I'm saying is that we're not saying spending on poles and wires is unnecessary back then nor going forward. It is so the only thing really that we're saying is you look at the last 20 years and you go, utility spending on poles and wires went up somewhere between 300 and 500%, while electricity demand at that time was flat. And one big reason why it was flat was because of rooftop solar. What that tells you is strategically deploying rooftop solar and batteries, actually rather than just having it happen, being strategic about it and incorporating it into energy planning. What you can do is use that as an instrument to be able to avoid, as much. You're going to still have to spend, but you don't have to spend as much. And one estimate is that the state could shave about $120 billion of spending over the next 30 years on poles and wires, which would save the average ratepayer about $300 a year. So that's all it's really saying. Obviously, you have to parse out. This is where we need good regulators and we need good leaders who can parse out those questions, get into the weeds and be able to, yes, that good, that unnecessary, that we have an alternative, that kind of thing. Am I calling on people or does somebody else call on people?
Yeah, how's it time? I think we're good. Okay, keep on going.
You were next, yeah.
Two quick questions. The first one, I saw that hydro was shrinking. Where does the hydro energy go? Are plants being decommissioned? And then the second one, can the transmission and wiring money be somehow channeled into the microgrid building that will strengthen communities?
So on the first question, I don't know. I'm sure there's somebody in the room that does. And on the second, I think that's the dream for many of us in this space is rooftop solar and batteries are sort of the building blocks of a microgrid. You need some other things as well to kind of have a true microgrid. But, I think there's a lot of people in our space who are kind of like, if we had really good leadership, we would be envisioning creating small scale, medium scale, and large scale microgrids around the state as a way to kind of protect those communities, make them more resilient, reduce the overall cost of the grid and that sort of thing. And so, yeah, it's like, we need to expand the toolkit, the tool set that energy planners are using to be able to kind of manage the grid. And we're sort of going, you have one big solution right under your noses that you keep vilifying and sort of suppressing. We're saying, let's elevate that. And I don't know the answer on hydro, but I'm sure somebody does. Sounds like you do.
I have the answer to this
Yeah.
question. Mostly due to the snowpack. Mostly due to snowpack. Or lack thereof.
Lack of their.
Less hydropower.
All right, we're going to the next question.
You gave, you said PG&E, you gave them a lot of the credit for the current state of affairs. Why PG&E versus SCE or SDG&E?
Oh, I think I was just being rhetorical. I mean, all three utilities, as far as we can tell, they work as one political unit. They coordinate their spending, they coordinate their lobbying. I don't think there's any daylight between them.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just wondered about you. Loretta Lynch had a wonderful piece on NPR that says exactly, the former president of the CPUC.
Yeah, Loretta Lynch is a former president of the CPUC. She's a treasure, a national treasure, in my opinion. She got a real inside window. A lot of the work that we've done and tried to just understand what the hell is going on has come from her work. And so we work with her a lot.
Yeah, it's really cool to see that there's not a big increase in energy usage despite our push for electrification because of the energy efficiency increase. I'm wondering what the peak demands look like in their correlation to the poles and wires spending.
Well, the line that I showed you was peak demand.
Peak demand.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, sorry, I was, it sounds like you might even know this. I mean, I'm not by any means an expert, but basically grid planning is done on the basis of peak demand. Like, you know, the couple of days a year when you're using the most amount of electricity, you build the grid to handle that. And so that's kind of the right marker when you're trying to go like that. So yeah, that was peak demand.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. I'm losing track of whose hands were up first. What's it?
I just have a clarification question.
Yeah.
So that plot that you showed that had like the percentage of natural gas and solar, that was percentages, right? So that doesn't actually say anything about total energy use. So it's entirely possible that energy use has increased or that the amount of hydropower is actually the same over time. It's just that its percentage has shrunk.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah. It doesn't all line up, you know, perfectly, but when you look at these.
Wasn't the snowpack.
All right, was there, I see hands here. Yeah.
I still have one. I'm curious, it sounds like you've been in this for a while, and we do quite a bit on trying to end line extension allowances at our line, so this is something that we're trying to figure out later. The business model is very clear for them. They need to just, like you said, they need to build. I'm curious the extent to which you would think us deregulating electricity in the 90s with AB 1980 got us to this place where utilities now have shareholders that they're going to account to regardless of what the states, because I worked in the legislature for a long time, and they're just going to move the goalposts. There's no such thing for them as like being held to, you know, the gospel around hitting goals. They'll just move them, especially since term limits are a thing. But I guess I'm just curious now, if I'm the utilities, and I go back almost 20 years, right? Because we deregulated right before early 2000s.
Yep.
Isn't this just kind of an inherent, like, unintended consequence of deregulating and saying, guess what, utilities, now you have shareholders you answer to, not the state's clean energy goals?
Yeah, so, and there's people that know a lot more, I think, in this room than I about the history here, but the key thing that I've heard was like a turning point in the deregulation was by basically telling the utilities, you're not going to make money from the generation anymore. The way you're going to make money is through poles and wires. That's where you get to tack on your guaranteed rate of return. That was kind of the beginning of them going, well, if that's how we're going to make our money, then we're going to really make our money that way. And so, like, you know, I think I'm not an expert on Hawaii, but I think Hawaii is like the one example that has been given where they're trying to kind of decouple that incentive and instead have the utility be paid more on the basis of a broader range of performance metrics, like reliability, affordability, like consumer-centered metrics. I mean, I think the project, for people that really want to do that, I think the project is similar to like what Obamacare was about, you know, where instead of doctors, you know, providers getting paid just literally to do procedures, it was doctors are getting paid and health organizations are getting paid more for outcomes. And clearly that's like a hard project. So I think, you know, I think there's people that I think is probably one of the most important questions policymakers ultimately have to grapple with. The reason why I don't talk about it that much is because it's a hard thing to kind of get a lot of people rallied up about. And I think we have kind of a first order thing, which is the people want the rooftop solar. So let's go get the rooftop solar and then kind of let the disruption sort of force another smart person to go, well, let's change the incentive structure too. All right, thank you.